So what were the reservations that the British made in the McMahon-Hussein correspondence? First of all, certain areas were excluded from the Arab state on the grounds that they were not purely Arab. And this referred especially to the portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo. British promises also related only to those portions of the territories wherein Great Britain was free to act without detriment to her ally France. These reservations were cause for great controversy after the war, especially on the question of Palestine. But it was not that the British had promised the same territories to different players. As many people often say, Palestine the twice promised land, it was not so. In fact, there was no real substantial discrepancy between the documents Sykes-Picot and the Hussein-McMahon correspondence and thereafter the Balfour Declaration. Generally, the British had been quite consistent. The correspondence was just that. That is, it was just a correspondence. It was not an agreement. And there was no final agreement, but just the presentation of positions. The Zionists and the British tended to argue for a long time that the exclusion of Palestine from the Arab state was on the basis of that sentence that speaks of the exclusion of the portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo. But to explain the exclusion of Palestine on those grounds is impossible. The argument that the Zionists and their supporters made cannot be sustained by the text nor the reality on the ground. What the Zionists and their supporters did was to argue that by the word districts, the documents meant the equivalent of the Ottoman province, Vilayet. And if, as we see on the map, the Vilayet of Damascus, stretching all the way down, including what is today Transjordan, if one looks at the portions of Syria west to the Vilayet of Damascus, that would exclude Palestine. If indeed the word districts refers to Vilayet. But as we can see on the map, Hama and Homs were not Vilayets. And to the west of the Vilayet of Aleppo is only the Mediterranean Sea. So the exclusion on the grounds that districts means Vilayet is impossible. And Palestine could not have been excluded on those grounds. What they did mean in the exclusion of the portions of Syria lying to the west of that line was to Mount Lebanon and to the Maronite population in Mount Lebanon, who did not see themselves as Arabs. But then there is the other reservation. The sentence which says that the promises to the Arabs related only to those portions of the territories wherein Great Britain is free to act without detriment to her ally France. And it is in accordance with that sentence that Britain could not have promised Palestine to the Arab state without consulting France. After all, as we have seen in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine is an area in which the French share responsibility with the British. So the question is, why for years did the British try to explain that the exclusion was on the basis of this impossible Vilayet argument? They could have just said that Palestine was excluded because of the previous secret understanding with France. But in the aftermath of the First World War, to argue that the territories were excluded because they were not Arab was in accordance with the principle of self-determination. Whereas to argue in the name of secret deals with the French or other colonial powers were no longer politically correct in the aftermath of World War I. In the aftermath of World War I, with the rise of anti-colonial powers like the United States and the Soviet Union, it was no longer possible to argue according to the old imperial rules of secret agreements between great powers. Self-determination was the name of the game, also according to the principles of President Wilson, and therefore the argument about exclusion or exclusion had to be made in the name of self-determination, even if in terms of the documentation they could not make sense. Whatever came of the Arab uprising that the British had hoped for in their correspondence with Hussein ibn Ali? Actually, not much. Hussein declared his revolt against the Ottomans in June 1916, accusing the Ottomans of their religious deviation. That is, they weren't Islamic enough, too secular, too reformist. It was not really in the name of Arab nationalism. But the great majority of Arabs did not rebel, and they remained loyal to the empire and were very unwilling to join in an uprising against the Ottoman Sultan, who they still regarded as their legitimate leader. The Arab revolt, therefore, was really not a great contribution to the war effort. The contribution was indeed very minor. And in the words of T. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, the Arab revolt was nothing but a sideshow of a sideshow. The British in Cairo had been unrealistic in their views about the attraction of Arab nationalism. They had given Arab nationalism far more weight than the people in the Middle East themselves had actually attached to it.